During the early years of the 1980s, Japan was experiencing incredible economic growth, and among the many prospering industries, the young personal computer market was also beginning to rise in popularity. New platforms were being established one after the other, and companies across the country began developing software to meet customer demand. Most personal computers of this era were designed for business use, but among all the professional applications and word processors were also video games. The Space Invader boom had already taken over Japan in the late 70s, so many Japanese computer games of this time were small amusements that were similar to popular arcade titles. PC game development was still virgin territory for many Japanese companies, and genres that were beginning to grow in popularity in the West had not yet been established in Japan. So, month to month, developers were releasing PC games that were the first of their kind to be made in Japan. And before things like role-playing games would explode in popularity, a small computer shop helped cause a boom of its own when it released Japan's first graphical adventure game in 1982, a small, unassuming title called Mystery House 1. A game that many people today would brush off as being a simple imitation of another title of the same name, but that nonetheless sent ripples through the industry that are still being felt to this day, helping to popularize the adventure genre in Japan, influencing future legendary creators, and establishing a genre that was impossible to experience in the arcades. The name of the computer shop that published Mystery House 1 was Microcabin Yokkaichi, which, as its name implies, was located in the Mie Prefecture in the city of Yokkaichi. The store was founded by a computer hobbyist named Naoto Oyachi, who, before Microcabin's founding, was an employee at his father's electronics store called Oyachi Denki. Among the store's televisions and other electronics, Naoto convinced his father to also open a department dedicated to PCs in 1980, after becoming obsessed with microcomputers in the late 70s. After the department was opened, computer users began flocking to the store. Oyachi Denki was one of only a handful of stores in the prefecture that sold computers, and Naoto was far more knowledgeable about the machines than any of their competitors. Thus, Oyachi Denki soon became a go-to spot for local enthusiasts that wanted to visit a computer shop that really knew the products they were selling. Around the same time, Naoto also partnered with a local manufacturing company called Itoi Seisakusho Corporation to create a payroll calculation program that could run on a personal computer instead of requiring specialized hardware, which ended up being so successful that it became well known among various businesses within Yokkaichi. And after finding success selling both computer hardware and software, Oyachi was convinced that his future lay in the personal computer market. So, on November 27, 1981, he borrowed some money from his father and established his own store solely dedicated to selling PC products, called Microcabin Yokkaichi. At his new shop, customers would often show Naoto PC games they were making in their spare time, in order to get his feedback as a fellow hobbyist. One day, a former regular at Oyachi Denki showed Naoto a game he had been making for the MZ-80B, a sleek-looking business computer produced by Sharp in 1981. The man's name was Dr. Tsukasa Moritani, a local dentist that had created a game that was unlike any other Japanese PC title at the time. As previously stated, most Japanese computer games in the very early 80s were rudimentary action games, or recreations of tabletop games like Mahjong, basically simplified versions of the types of games one could find in an arcade. But Moritani's game was something different. The title involved the player exploring the interior of a Western-style mansion through a first-person perspective in order to find treasure hidden within, all while collecting items and solving riddles along the way. It was a slower, more thoughtfully paced game, something that couldn't be experienced in an arcade atmosphere. Oyachi was impressed with Moritani's game and was convinced it could be a commercial hit. So he helped Moritani finish the title and sold it alongside other games that were shown to him by the hobbyists that gathered at his store. These games were announced to the public around May of 1982, with Moritani's game releasing first in June, under the name Mystery House, or Mystery House 1 according to the Japanese on the box. As the number implies, a Mystery House 2 was already being advertised before the first was even released, with Microcabin claiming that Mystery House would be the first in a collection of adventure games which promised to challenge the limits of the player's brain. However, by today's standards, Mystery House 1 looks incredibly basic. The title begins with a graphic of the titular Mystery House being drawn on screen, as a bat flies in, accompanied by a tinny rendition of the Pink Panther theme. Wireframe graphics of each location are displayed on screen, and a text prompt is located beneath where the player can type in commands to move around in the 4 cardinal directions. If they encounter something they want to interact with, they can type a verb like open, and then a noun like rack, in order to have the character open the rack in front of them. There were no other characters besides the player, and there was no real story to speak of. The player simply explored this empty mansion, gathering items and looking around until they found the diamond hidden inside. Looking at the title today, it may be hard to understand why Mystery House 1 gave Naoto so much confidence in its sales potential, especially since the game was far from the first of its kind. During the 1970s, the text adventure had grown in popularity in the West, which had the same gameplay while being completely text-based. In fact, just 2 months earlier, ASCII magazine had actually released Japan's first ever text adventure, called Omotesando Adventure, which was written out in BASIC inside the pages of the publisher's 1982 April Fool's issue. Additionally, Mystery House 1 was not the first adventure game to feature graphics, or even the first game to be called Mystery House. Microcabin's Mystery House 1 was very clearly imitating the gameplay and presentation of Online Systems' Mystery House, released for the Apple II computer back in 1980, even going as far as to borrow the name. The Mystery House, developed by Roberta and Ken Williams, was the first adventure game to feature in-game graphics, and had become a hit in America, spawning several other high-res adventures from the company. These games were even played by some Apple users in Japan, who could purchase Online Systems games from computer shops that imported the titles from the US. Microcabin's game was almost identical, even containing similar puzzles and goals. Mystery House 1 didn't have a murder mystery storyline like Online Systems game, and the title didn't directly copy anything, but the overall presentation and gameplay feels almost like a recreation of the Apple II classic that someone made based on their imperfect memory of the game. So what made Mystery House 1 so special? While it wasn't completely original, Microcabin's Mystery House 1 was still the first game of its kind to be made in Japan, and more importantly, it was the first adventure game many Japanese computer users actually played. Both the American Mystery House and even Omotesando Adventure had a large language barrier, with Omotesando being written completely in English. This was due to the simple fact that the Japanese language itself didn't work well with simple verb-noun commands for a text parser without sounding a little awkward, making a completely text-based game difficult to realize at the time. While Mystery House 1 did use English verbs and nouns, the rest of the game was written in simple Japanese, and thanks to the game's visuals, it wasn't necessary to have a lot of text to begin with, which ultimately made it more accessible to a Japanese audience. And while Mystery House was initially only released for the Sharp MZ80B and MZ2000, the game was quickly ported to a number of Japanese PC platforms, making it widely available to any kind of PC user. Thanks to all this, Mystery House 1 was the right game at the right time with the right audience. The simple act of typing in commands to interact with a virtual environment captured the imagination of its players, and copies of Mystery House 1 were soon flying off the shelves. Since Microcabin Yokkaichi was located in the Mie Prefecture, it appears that Mystery House 1 might have initially only been sold in the Kansai region of Japan, but by August 1982, Microcabin had expanded their sales network nationwide, and computer users from across the country were now playing Moritani's Mystery House. In late 1982, Mystery House 1 was ranked as the third best-selling PC game in Osaka, and by 1983, Mystery House was a well-known hit within the albeit small Japanese PC market. At a time when sales of PC games were lucky if they reached 10,000 units, Microcabin advertised that Mystery House had sold over 30,000 copies, with some even speculating that the game ultimately sold around 50,000 units across various platforms. In fact, Mystery House had become such an iconic computer game by 1983 that it was even featured heavily in a popular educational manga called Hello Microcomputer, which starred a well-known manga and anime character named Arashi from Game Center Arashi. The second book in the series contained a chapter that heavily featured Microcabin's Mystery House, going into great detail on how the game was played. Thanks to publications like this, even younger audiences were now suddenly becoming interested in the adventure genre, and computer games in general, which was considered a market mainly for adults at the time. Once a small local computer shop, Mystery House's success led to Microcabin dropping Yokkaichi from their name and re-establishing themselves as a corporation in November 1982, where they quickly grew into one of the most prominent PC game developers of the era. While today the company is mainly remembered for their role-playing games, during these early days of the studio they were most famous for their various adventure titles released after Mystery House. In fact, Microcabin was so strongly associated with the genre that they even adopted the slogan of "We Make Adventure Spirit," with their logo still sporting an icon of a detective to this day. However, more important than Microcabin's success was how the release of Mystery House influenced other PC developers. Just as players were being captivated by Mystery House, so too were game creators inspired by its success. Pretty much every developer publishing games for the PC market began pumping out adventure games just as soon as the new year began in 1983. One of the first to jump on the bandwagon was Hummingbird Soft, who released The Palms in January 1983, a title set in an outdoor environment compared to the confined indoor setting of Mystery House 1. T&E Soft released The Legend of Star Arthur, a graphically advanced title that told a Star Wars-esque storyline and even featured a basic point-and-click interface. System Soft published Mio's Mystery Adventure. Thinking Rabbit released The Keyhole Murder Case. Dizeniland was created by Hudson Soft, and the up-and-coming Nihon Falcom released Horror House, all within a few months of each other. Even Online Systems licensed the original Apple II Mystery House to a Japanese company called StarCraft, who published and translated the title in 1983. Microcabin had caused a variable adventure game boom in Japan's PC market. For the next few years, some of the biggest games coming from PC developers were adventure titles, and during this adventure game gold rush, several legendary creators released their first breakout hits. One such creator was a young man named Yuji Horii, who released the Portopia serial murder case in June 1983, a game where the player controlled a detective solving a murder mystery. Horii had previously created a simple tennis game as part of a programming contest earlier in the year, but Portopia was the title that jump-started his video game career. This success led to Yuji Horii making two other adventure titles in the early 80s, and directly led to him eventually creating the seminal Dragon Quest on the Famicom in 1986. A title that defined the RPG genre in Japan. Additionally, even the creator of Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi, got his start producing adventure games at Square like the Death Trap series, long before he would become famous for his epic role-playing games. And the aforementioned Nihon Falcom published several adventure games in their early history, including Azteca and Azteca 2, which were directed by Masaya Hashimoto, who would later direct the first three Ys games. Many developers got their start making adventure games during this boom, and the genre quickly evolved away from the treasure-hunting gameplay of Mystery House to instead be graphical showpiece titles that creators often used as a platform to express more detailed stories. However, the early 80s was a time when a game could be created in a matter of months instead of years, so the industry changed very quickly. Only 3 or 4 years after the boom began, the adventure genre was already beginning to wane a bit in the PC market, as RPGs began dominating the sales charts. Even Microcabin, who pioneered the genre in Japan, eventually stopped making original adventure games to instead focus on making licensed titles based on anime properties, before they also found success with RPGs after they released the first entry in their popular Zack franchise. However, the adventure genre still continued to find success on the PC, with many notable titles being released in the late 80s and beyond. The genre eventually also found new life on home consoles, when a port of Yuji Hoри's Portopia began lighting up the sales charts on the Famicom in 1985, causing its own adventure boom in the console market. The genre has evolved considerably over the years in Japan, and has remained active, but just like in the West, adventure games go through waves of popularity, and have since become a fairly niche genre. Regardless, it cannot be understated how important Microcabin's Mystery House was during the early days of Japan's game industry. While it is easy to look at the game as a simple copycat of the Apple II original, the impact it had is immeasurable in many ways. Because of the boom it caused, many early creators got their start making adventure games, and this eventually led to those same creators defining the RPG genre in Japan. This might be why some JRPGs feel like story-heavy adventure games with added combat. In fact, many old gaming publications from the 80s often lumped adventure and role-playing games together as similar genres. Additionally, there are still people making adventure games today that were directly inspired by Mystery House 1. While creators seldom specify which Mystery House they are talking about in interviews, the producer of the Science Adventure series has stated specifically that one of the first computer games he ever played was Mystery House 1 on the MZ2000, which inspired him to start making games himself. Today, Microcabin no longer makes video games, and its founder, Naoto Oyachi, has retired. And after making Dreamland in '83, Moritani seemingly returned to his dental business. While few people may be aware of their existence today, the adventure spirit these two instilled in players in the 80s still lives on today. Their game introduced a new form of gameplay to many Japanese players, laid the groundwork for future genres, and helped create a type of game that still continues to be made in some form to this day, all thanks to an imitation created by a local dentist and the owner of a small local computer shop.